This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you're looking at didn't arrive suddenly. It didn't explode into existence. It didn't announce itself. It grew quietly, inside the paperwork, inside routine decisions, inside institutions that were trusted to protect you. For years, something was allowed to operate in plain sight, not because it was invisible, but because it looked familiar. Law, process, authority. And while attention stayed fixed on street-level crime, on isolated violence, on individual acts, the system underneath adjusted, slowly, deliberately, without alarms. This is the moment when that adjustment became impossible to ignore. Not because order worked, but because it almost didn't. If you think this is just another law enforcement story, stay with me. Because the real danger isn't what was found, it's where it was allowed to live. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This doesn't end here. It's only opening the door. What actually controls a system like this is not violence. Violence is loud. Violence draws attention. Violence gets blamed. What controls it is permission. Permission to delay, permission to overlook. Permission to treat warning signs as paperwork problems instead of danger signals. Power doesn't collapse when criminals arrive. It collapses when institutions adjust around them. At some point, enforcement stops being a wall. It becomes a filter, not stopping harm, just deciding which harm is inconvenient, and that decision is rarely dramatic. It happens in meetings, in court schedules. In resource allocations, no one audits closely. This is why personalities don't matter here. Not the shooters, not the suspects, not even the officials, because the system did exactly what it was allowed to do. It absorbed pressure. It redirected responsibility. It normalized exceptions. And once exceptions become routine, the system stops defending the public. It starts defending itself. That's the shift. Quiet, legal, catastrophic, and the most dangerous part? By the time it becomes visible, it's already been working for years. Which brings us to what changed without anyone voting on it. There was a time when this kind of operation would have been impossible to miss. Not because it was smaller, but because the system reacted differently. Before, warning signs triggered friction, reviews, pushback, questions that slowed everything down. Now, they trigger accommodation, schedules shift, jurisdictions blur, responsibility fragments until no single office feels accountable. Nothing illegal has to happen for this shift to take place. That's the danger. What changed wasn't the law. It was tolerance, small decisions, each defensible on its own, each temporary, each justified as practical, but stacked together, they rewired the system. Before, enforcement chased patterns. Now, it manages incidents. Before, institutions disrupted networks. Now, they respond to symptoms, and slow change is the hardest to detect because it feels reasonable, because it feels calm, because by the time you notice the difference between before and now, you're already living inside the consequences. And when the first visible shock finally arrived, it didn't look like a warning. It looked like an exception. That's where this stops being abstract. And where the first fracture appears, the first shock didn't announce itself as systemic. It arrived as an incident, contained, explained quickly, a confrontation, a single decision made in seconds, an outcome everyone was told to argue about. And that's exactly why it worked. Because while attention locked onto the surface, onto blame, justification, footage, reaction, the system underneath was already moving. What followed was not hesitation. It was coordination, not public. Procedural. Doors closed at hours no one was watching. Movement without press. Decisions executed as routine. What was revealed in that window wasn't chaos. It was density. too many connections, too much infrastructure, too much preparation for something that was supposed to be isolated. And here's the critical detail. This did not stop after the incident. It accelerated. If you think this was just a response to a single event, pause here. Because the scale that emerged next only makes sense if the system already knew what it would find. This was not discovery. It was confirmation. And confirmation only happens when the groundwork is already laid. Which raises a question that no official briefing answered. What had been protected long enough to grow this large? Here is where the story usually gets simplified. Bad actors, hidden villains, a few people who slipped through the cracks. That explanation is comforting and wrong. What actually allowed this to function wasn't secrecy. It was structure, a system designed to process volume, not intent, forms instead of patterns, compliance instead of curiosity. When activity fits inside existing procedures, it doesn't raise alarms. It generates files, and files can be delayed, reassigned, buried. Protection didn't come from force. It came from legitimacy, titles that slowed scrutiny, credentials that redirected questions, processes that required permission to interrupt, while enforcement focused on the visible edges, traffic stops, isolated crimes, individual arrests. The core absorbed the pressure. Damage didn't disappear. It was displaced. Communities carried it. Hospitals absorbed it. Families paid for it. And the system recorded none of that as failure. Because on paper, everything was moving correctly. That's the mechanism. And once you understand it, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't allowed to exist by accident. It was allowed because stopping it would have required breaking routine. And routine is the hardest thing to confront, which is why the next phase didn't look like reform. It looked like escalation. Once the shield cracked, everything moved at once. No warnings, no gradual exposure, simultaneity. Doors opened in different places at the same time. Systems that had never been stressed together suddenly were, and the response wasn't confusion, it was resistance, prepared, armed, immediate. That detail matters. Because you don't stage for violence unless you expect intervention. And you don't expect intervention unless you've survived it before. What followed wasn't disorder. It was proof of anticipation, fallback locations, redundant routes, contingencies activated in minutes. This wasn't adaptation. It was rehearsal. And every exchange confirmed the same thing. This network didn't grow despite enforcement pressure. It grew alongside it. While agencies chased fragments, the core learned the system's rhythms, how long delays lasted, which warnings never escalated, where oversight thinned. By the time confrontation became unavoidable, the machine was already built. And here's the part that doesn't get said out loud. If this had failed quietly, nothing would have stopped it from continuing. Which means the real margin here wasn't success. It was timing. And timing in systems like this is never guaranteed. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because this isn't about raids or indictments. It's about you living inside a system that didn't intervene when it could have. You felt it before it had a name. Overcrowded emergency rooms, neighborhoods that changed without explanation, stories that sounded unrelated until they weren't. You were told these were separate problems. Crime here, addiction there, policy somewhere else. But what you were actually experiencing was load transfer. When institutions fail quietly, they don't absorb damage. They export it to hospitals, to schools, to families who never consented to carry it. You pay in time, in safety, in grief that never makes a briefing slide. And the most unsettling part, none of this required malice from everyone involved, just enough people doing their jobs without asking what the job had become. If this feels uncomfortably close, stay with me, because recognition is not resolution. And if you've ever wondered why accountability always arrives late, that answer is still ahead. At this point, it stops being local, not because the activity moved, but because the consequences did. What was built to operate quietly in one place began to distort systems far beyond it. Supply chains don't respect city lines. Neither does tolerance. When pressure eases in one jurisdiction, it doesn't disappear. It migrates. Routes adjust. Markets rebalance. Risk gets priced in, and suddenly, patterns that once looked like isolated failures start matching across regions. Similar delays, similar blind spots, similar excuses framed as logistical limits. This is how systemic weakness travels. Not through ideology, through replication. What worked once becomes a template. What wasn't punished becomes acceptable elsewhere. And here's the destabilizing truth. Nothing about this required coordination between cities or conspiracies spanning borders. All it required was the same structural conditions, enough complexity to blur responsibility, enough trust to reduce scrutiny, enough routine to make anomalies feel normal. By the time anyone asks whether this is happening somewhere else, the answer is already outdated. Because the system doesn't wait for awareness, it adapts faster than recognition, and that leaves only one unresolved question. What happens next now that the pattern is visible? From here, the system doesn't return to what it was. It moves forward, one way or another. There is a path where adjustment happens. Oversight tightens, exceptions shrink. Familiar routines are interrupted before they harden again. This path doesn't look dramatic. It looks tedious, and it requires sustained attention long after headlines fade. There is another path, more common, more comfortable: erosion, where reforms exist on paper, but habits remain untouched, where exposure produces temporary caution, not structural change, where everyone assumes someone else is watching now. In this version, nothing collapses quickly. It just weakens, quietly, again. And then there is the third path: rupture, where pressure accumulates faster than systems can absorb it, where legitimacy breaks before correction arrives, where intervention comes only after damage becomes undeniable. This is the path people insist won't happen, until it does. None of these outcomes are theoretical. All of them are already visible in fragments. What determines which one dominates isn't intent, it's follow-through. And that's the part no system can automate, which is why the ending to this story isn't an ending at all. It's a hinge. If you're waiting for this to end with relief, it doesn't, because systems don't change just because they're exposed. They change when attention refuses to move on. What this revealed wasn't a hidden monster. It was something more unsettling. How close normal operations came to protecting the wrong outcomes. How easily trust became camouflage. How long damage was allowed to accumulate without triggering intervention. Nothing here guarantees immunity next time. Visibility fades. Urgency decays. Routine returns. And the conditions that allowed this to grow, they weren't rare. They were familiar. The danger isn't that this happened. It's that it didn't look extraordinary while it was happening. If accountability only appears after collapse, then collapse becomes the system's correction mechanism. And that is not a safeguard. It's a gamble. So don't treat this as closure. Treat it as a test of attention, of memory, of whether scrutiny survives comfort. If you want to understand how systems signal failure before they break, stay here. If you want to see where the next fracture is forming, that's where we go next. Because the warning didn't end with this case. It started here,